Welcome back to the SHAKA Movement's Malama Aina TV show here at Akaku Studios in downtown Kahului, Maui. Thank you so much to Akaku TV for making this wonderful facility available to this community. What a tremendous service this facility is to this community. We're here today, as always, presenting information, the best sourced, independent information that we can find that is not filtered or controlled by corporate interests, any corporate interests, either the pro-GMO or supposedly this organic movement that the GMO folks are constantly saying are out to get them unreasonably, that there are forces at work that are trying to destroy GMOs. Well, hey, some of the GMOs need to be destroyed. It's a fantastic, amazing scientific ability to be able to take genes and move them around, but it's being done for profit. It's not being done for science. It's not being done to feed the world. It's being done for profit, and it's being abused like anything else. Big business has made it their own. We're in a unique conflagration of forces that are circling around and trying to control things to make them money. It's just pure exploitation, and that's what's going on in Hawaii. It's what's going around all around the world. Maui County plays a central role in some of it. Monsanto, among others, manufactures their BT corn seed here. 80% of the corn seed that's grown throughout the entire world is grown here on Maui and shipped around the world. And if you don't know what BT corn seed is, it's the corn. It's not for human consumption. It's the corn that has been genetically modified so that within the corn, every cell of the corn, the plant itself manufactures its own pesticides. So that if bugs eat it, the bug dies, or at least it doesn't like the taste. And so the plant itself has been genetically modified to include this poison in the plant. Now it's a poison that exists in nature. It is used in organic farming, actually, naturally derived. Not the genetically modified. There's a big difference between the two. The companies would have you believe that there's no difference between the two. But there is a difference between the two. BT poison, as it appears naturally in the soil, is light years different from the BT toxins that are manufactured in the plant itself. The one comparison is that if you wanted to get a toxic load of BT into your body in some other way than through the genetically modified corn, if you wanted to get that load in the natural way, you would have to eat tons of dirt an hour for like a week. To be able to get the concentration that BT is in the soil as what it is in the corn plant. So there's no comparison between the two. But yet here in Maui County, this stuff is grown. It's a predominant crop. It's requiring heavy uses of pesticides, more and more herbicides, because of the natural forces that attack corn are getting resilient. They're able to survive. And so the company's answer is, well, we'll just spray more. We'll just spray more herbicides on them, and we'll make stronger herbicides and put them out. And that's what they're doing here. That's what they're testing here. Hawaii is one of the principal testing research facilities for this genetically modified crops. They're growing their operations. They're very successful. They're doing really well. They're buying land in Maui County. They're expanding their operations, and what that means are perhaps a few more local jobs, but it also means that there's an increasing pesticide load. Pesticides that they spray in the fields don't necessarily stay in the fields. The stuff leaches out. There is spray drift when they spray the stuff. There is runoff for heavy rains. There's fugitive dust. And so these chemicals get into the local community. And there's only how much can we imagine that an island, a delicate ecosystem of these islands here, how much pesticides and herbicides can these islands withstand? At what point does the stuff get so toxic that it begins to affect every aspect of life on the island? And they don't have the answer, and they don't seem to care. Their track record shows, as a company and as an industry, that they don't care. They go into communities, they do their manufacturing of chemicals, they leave behind poisons, and they try and walk away. In a number of different instances, they've been sued. The lawsuits are astounding. $300 million in the 90s, a $300 million lawsuit in Alabama for dioxin. And they sue each other. They go back and forth. Syngenta, one of the biotech companies, sued Monsanto for coercive tactics to monopolize markets. And eventually, after a bunch of whole lawsuits back and forth, they all settled out of court. They worked it out amongst themselves. Other fines, 2005, a $1.5 million fine for disguising invoices as consulting fees. They were actually bribes. There were hundreds of people that they bribed in India to get their cotton, I think it was, to get their cotton approved. They've mislabeled stuff. Roundup originally, they tried to market that and say that it was biodegradable. On the label it said biodegradable. Well, it's not biodegradable. They lied. They made that up, and they had to take it off. They were sued. So these are companies that do stuff that you wouldn't do. They do stuff that you don't really want them doing to you. But over the past 30 years, there's been a culture of this genetically modified seed exploration, all of these experiments that have come to Hawaii to do their evolution. They've come here, for some very good reasons. I mean, they came, we've got tremendous weather, 4 growing seasons a year, so that they can just, plant repeated crops and move the process of selective breeding and this genetically, generational stuff. They can move that along more quickly. Unfortunately, that means that we get 4 doses of pesticides and herbicides and chemicals every year. So whatever their structured program for their crops are, since they have 4 growing seasons, we get 4 times the dose. That doesn't happen on the mainland. That makes what's going on in Hawaii, everywhere where biotech is being performed in the fields, that makes it tremendously unique. That's very different than what's going on in other places in the world, and why what's going on here is really so meaningful. You can't get away from this stuff. We've had tests. 100% of the samples, the water samples that were taken, recently studied, showed pesticides from current or past agriculture. They're everywhere. These companies have changed the fabric of our lives, nationally and especially here in Hawaii. And they don't seem to care. When asked to divulge what they're spraying and when, they refuse. They say that that's, protected information, that they proprietary, it's business secrets. Maui County, signed, the mayor took it upon himself to sign an agreement with Monsanto, voluntary disclosure agreement, but it has no teeth. They're not really giving you any information. Once a year, they're going to give you a list of what pesticides and how much they sprayed. What they don't tell you and what they won't tell you is what combinations they sprayed these pesticides in. There's a number of loopholes in the system. And one of the biggest loopholes in the system is that they are allowed to distribute pesticides and herbicides, chemicals in the field separately. By separately, I mean from different tanks. The EPA wants to know what's in a tank. So if they load up chemicals in a tank, they got to write down what's in that tank. There can be a tank right next to it, a different load of chemicals, and it's on a different list, and nobody's paying attention to when they spray that stuff. So you got this tank, tank A, tank B, spray this stuff out, and maybe they wait, maybe they don't wait. Maybe they wait a week, but the stuff doesn't dissipate, it's there for a while. And so next comes tank B. Well, when tank material A and tank material B meet each other in the field, they have chemical reactions to one another. And chemists and toxic scientists, toxologists, medical toxologists, they know that when chemicals are combined with one another, it changes their functionality. It changes how, like for instance, how the stuff might permeate your skin and how it would get into your bloodstream. When they present their case to the EPA and the FDA, the chemical companies present studies where they take the active chemical compound by itself in a dish and they test it alone. But that's not how they actually use the stuff in the fields. They add stuff to it in the tank to make it spray better, to make it cling better, to make it do all kinds of things. And those additives in combination are not studied. They're not reported, they're not tracked. And that's a huge loophole in the system. It allows the chemical companies to do, Agent Orange, for instance, was a chemical cocktail. It was a combination of different pesticides and chemicals that each had their own function. And when combined, they would really screw you up. Extremely toxic. They're spraying those very components. To this day, they're spraying the individual components of Agent Orange. I think it's 2 out of the 3. They just tank them separately. And so there's no record of are they overlapping. And so we're left completely in the dark. When when people ask, gee, maybe you shouldn't be spraying this stuff near schools. Their response is, we don't care. We're just going to spray it wherever we want. You try and create a law that stops us from doing that, we'll sue you. So how is that, how is that Pono? I mean, how do you come to a state, to a land, to a people, and slowly, innocently at first? I mean, they came here because of the good weather, and they started this whole culture of genetically modified seeds, to make the world a better place. And the people involved in it, they're totally down with it. This is their thing. This is what they do. When the county council here on Maui received testimony a couple of weeks ago, one of the guys who testified about the economic impact of the moratorium, what would be the economic impact if the moratorium is passed, and presented a notion. His introductory statements were that, in Europe they didn't want the GMOs. I don't know why. He said, I don't know why they didn't want the GMOs. This is a guy who was was actively involved. He and his father, I think, were some of the first people to recognize that you could do this work here on an accelerated basis. And they lured the biotech companies over and the seed companies over, and Monsanto and the other ones started buying up all of these companies over the years, and they've consolidated it all. But in the beginning, there were a bunch of little companies, and they were all trying to do new and different things with a good agenda. And they came here, and it became a hotbed for this kind of research. And so this guy's totally into it. This is his life. This is his thing. GMOs, GMOs, GMOs. And why Europe rejected GMOs is complete. He can't figure it out. And why anybody would want to eat organic food, he doesn't know. He said he wouldn't eat organic food if his life depended on it. Now, there's a lot of people that are looking for organic food. There's an entire sector of the population of the United States and the world. There are people that do care about what they eat and do want to eat clean, and they look for organic food. It's quantified, in the research of consumer habits and stuff. The LOHAS lifestyles of health and sustainability sector is a big sector of the marketplace. Especially when it comes to tourism here on Maui. There's a lot of people that are coming to Maui because they want that farm-to-table experience. They want that organic experience. And in fact, now they're actually saying specifically they want that non-GMO experience. And to whatever extent Maui continues to be identified with this thing, GMOs and pesticides, you think tourists are going to want to come here? We hear stories already that there's an entire community out of Vancouver, British Columbia that comes down here for the winters, and they're not coming to Maui next year because they're concerned about pesticide exposure and exposure to GMOs. So, these guys, this study analysis that he made up. He just worked these numbers up at home, with his calculator. To say that economic doom would happen if this moratorium goes through. That all of these jobs would be, it would wipe out the GMO industry. Well, it's not going to wipe out. The companies have a significant investment in property here and facilities here. They've got research that they're doing here. They got all kinds of things that they're doing here. They can do work that's not GMO related. They can do work that's not chemically dependent on the pesticides and herbicides the way that they are. They don't have to be doing the GMO work here. They got plenty of seeds that they now own because they bought up all of these companies. So they've got plenty of non-GMO seeds that they need to provide to a world that is increasingly looking for non-GMO seeds because GMOs are being rejected all around the world. And that's a growing trend that I don't think they counted on. They thought that they were on a track to take over the world's food supply and dominate every seed, that all seeds in the marketplace should be genetically modified and that they should be owned. That's a corporate agenda that is in their best interest. That's a corporate agenda that is not in your best interest, unless you're a major shareholder of the company. But most of us aren't. Most of us are living in a world where organic foods is a valuable thing. So this guy says that he would never dream of eating organic food. Why would you want to wash, poop off of your food? So it's a particular mindset that is expressly GMO related. That's their world. And I understand that. They're soil scientists and seed scientists. This is their world. They live in a little bubble. The problem is that they're forcing their bubble on you. And that's not right. Nobody asked you. They slowly, over time, developed this industry. Nobody really knew what was going on. The companies have been purchasing land and are being very successful in growing their pesticide-laden corn seeds here. And I would imagine they're expanding their operations. They're doing really well. Well, the more they expand, the more exposure we have to the pesticides. So how much can these islands withstand before the entire ecosystem is affected? And it's not the first time that outsiders have come to Hawaii and seen how good they can make it for themselves at the expense of the people who were here before them. And this is like the third wave. There's sugar cane and pineapple, and now this BT corn, genetically modified corn. Now that we're on. Just finish about the financial analysis that this fellow put forward, that the county council received with no questions. Was purely based on the agricultural sector. His analysis that if the moratorium goes through, every job would be lost, which is not true. The company has never said that. The company has never said that they can't switch or wouldn't switch to non-GMO seed production if the moratorium goes through for the period of time that it would take to do the safety studies that they want to do, that we want them to do rather, that they could alter their operations and work with non-GMO seeds for that period of time. They've never said that they're not willing to do that, but it's just assumed that every job related to GMO, if the moratorium goes through, every job would be lost. Well, it's a fabrication. It's just not true. And this guy's financial analysis of the situation is also extremely biased because he only looked at the agricultural sector, never for once even thinking that there would be a market out there that is not attracted to GMOs the way he is. He doesn't understand why Europe rejected GMOs. He doesn't understand why people seek out organic foods. He doesn't understand why people are looking for non-GMO dining experiences. He doesn't understand that there's an entire tourist industry that's based on providing those things to tourists who have money that want those things. They come to Maui for a health-oriented experience. We're known for that. There's, these healing modalities that are here on Maui, are well known throughout the world. And travelers come here from across the world to participate in that kind of healing practices. And they just ignore that. How do you just ignore? And it's the tourist industry is more jobs in tourism than there are in commercial agriculture. So how do you present? How does the council even accept and receive an analysis, a financial analysis that's only one sector? Again, they live in this bubble. They live in this happy GMO science bubble, and they think that everything is, that they know everything, but they don't. Even the whole notion of genetically modifying a living organism, that you can move the DNA around and take this attribute from a tomato and put it into a potato. These things come with a cost. It's like Jurassic Park. The scientists think that they can go ahead and do this stuff and that they will prevail over nature. Nature will always prevail. Nature will always prevail. And these folks, unfortunately, with their pesticides especially, are on the wrong end of the equation. Because now, over a period of time, the bugs and the weeds are starting to have a resistance to their herbicides and their chemicals. And so there are superbugs and superweeds. And since a lot of that research and a lot of the heavy pesticide use is being done here in Maui County, then we're also likely to see outbreaks of this stuff, where bugs here locally become resistant to the chemicals, and they have to use more of them, and that affects not just them, that also affects people who don't want to be doing genetically modified and heavy chemical style farming. That affects organic farmers, that affects natural farmers, traditional farming, subsistence living as a cultural practice. As superbugs and superweeds, invasive species, come into the environment, their ability to practice their style of farming is going to be destroyed. So what gives the right to this company in a bubble to destroy their way of life? That's not right. That's not Pono. And all of this happened very quietly, before anybody even knew what was going on. They had developed this massive industry here that is, it's sucking up all the water. It's loading the Aina down with chemicals and pesticides beyond a point where it's sustainable. It's killing the reefs. It's killing the biodiversity. They destroy all of the living organisms in the soil. They're generating, a commercial seed product, standardized. It's a commercial product, so everyone's got to be the same. They're all going to look alike. And the only way to do that is to minimize the amount of stress that's on the plant as it's growing, so that they're all perfect. The only way to do that is to get rid of any fungus, any bacteria, any bugs, any weeds. So they just load the soil down with herbicides and pesticides and mildicides and fungicides, and they just kill everything. They just sterilize the soil. It becomes a toxic soup. All of the natural soil functions cease. It just doesn't seem to fit with Hawaii. It doesn't seem to fit with Maui. It's just the wrong kind of thing to be doing here. And they've taken over the agricultural industry to the point where we're not growing food that anybody can eat. There's only a 3-day food supply here on Maui. We just had with the hurricane, those store shelves were empty. There was no food available. Fortunately, it wasn't a crisis here for us. Folks on the Big Island are still having troubles. But next time, and who wants to live that way? That's like the worst mainland kind of lifestyle, where we're blessed with this extraordinary climate. All right, the soil is a little bit rough because there's not a lot of biomaterial in the soil here. That clay and stuff. So you got to add that stuff to the soil to make it good. But you can, and it can be done. The soil can be rich, and the climate is certainly here. And there is water. Although, that's another huge issue of who controls the water here. So, it is, Hawaii Maui, Molokai used to be a garden basket. I mean, they used to grow everything there and export it. They used to feed people from all over the place. And all of that diversity vanished because the seeds companies came in with their chemical monocropping system, and they just have destroyed everything. They've taken it over, and their willingness to work and allow people to live a life that is unaffected by them. You can't. You can't live a life that's unaffected by them. They're everywhere. Their stuff is in your environment. It's in your home. It's on your clothes. It settles on your car. It settles on your towels at home. It's on your bed when you go to night. It's a fugitive dust that comes out of the fields. The stuff is just everywhere. And they try and they want everybody to believe that this is all okay. And so they've launched into, major public relations, functions, major campaigns to, present that this is normal, and it's not normal. It's a fabrication of their business model, and they are inflicting it on everyone relentlessly. Here in Hawaii, recently there's a comic book. I mean, you talk about propaganda. So they go into this. Went into the school. There's a school program sponsored by the chemical company. These are kids that were selected because they have an interest in science and they wanted an accelerated program, and they were looking to inspire these kids. And what they subjected them to was a comic book. They wrote their own comic book. And this is a story of Caitlin and her amazing day, a story about farming and DNA. It's Caitlin's amazing day, and Caitlin is presented with a situation where there's no cookies left. There's in the cookie jar, and the farmers have all left the farm at some future time because and there's a talking cockroach who comes and talks. And the talking cockroach takes her on a tour of the farm where she meets her uncle. She talks to Uncle, her farmer. So that this is constructed and designed for kids here in Hawaii. Uncle is wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and he's called Uncle. So it's pretty good indicators that it's Hawaii. And he says that it just got too hard to farm. And so we've left the farm. It just became too hard. We had water restrictions, and there was the papayas were sick, and the wind was damaging his corn crops, and it was just too hard. And so they gave up the farm. And so there's no food. She can't have her cookies because everybody's left the farm. But come to save the day is a genetic scientist. A goofy-looking genetic scientist has come and to save the day, and he's got DNA. He's got a DNA rap song. They go into a rap song. This is for kids. They go into a rap song about DNA and what it's good for, and hey, we're going to save the world, and hey, we're going to feed everybody. And you get the idea. I mean, it's propaganda, the worst kind. They're just making up a story and trying to convince kids that this is the only way, and that they are the solution to every problem. They're going to feed the world. You're going to see stuff come down the pike. As we get closer to the November election, more and more media in this market, on Maui and Molokai, wherever the election is going to take place, you'll see it on Lanai too. The company is, they're doing their focus group testing. They're in the process of fine-tuning their message to the Hawaiian people, just as this comic book is targeted to Hawaiian kids, calling the farmer uncle. they're fine-tuning their message. They've invited people. They're paying people, $100 a piece to come and have a steak dinner, so that they can pick their brains. And research and focus group their arguments and what it is, what do you think the issue is, and what do you think the solution is, and how can they represent themselves to you, whether it's true or not. This is not about the truth. This is about getting over on you. This is about getting over on this community so that they can continue to exploit this community and take their profits, leaving only poisons behind. They ship their BT corn seed is not edible. We don't eat it. They're not growing it food that anybody can eat. They're exploiting the resources of these islands for their own profits, and like I said, leaving only poisons behind. We're going to play a tape of Dr. Tyrone Hayes, who was a research scientist, biologist, doing studies on atrazine, one of the chemicals that's used in genetically modified crops. It's also one of the chemicals that's used by HC&S in the sugarcane fields. When they first do the planting, the first 18 weeks of planting, they spray atrazine into those fields. Well, Dr. Hayes was hired to do research on atrazine, and he found out some horrible stuff about it, that it leads to birth defects, typically in the genitals, where underformed babies or boys are born. This is graphic stuff. Boys are born and their urethra, they can't pee. It doesn't go all the way to the end. It's blocked and they need to be helped. And so he found out that this chemical, atrazine, has the ability to cause these problems. And the company didn't like that, so they fired him, and they've tried, desperately over years to destroy him, discredit him professionally, destroy him personally, he has managed to survive through the course of other lawsuits. Some of their internal documents were released to the court, and they were crazy enough to keep these documents. Where they literally, detail the strategy that they have in mind for discrediting him. That they're, going to find out this about him. They're going to, study his family. They're going to do all of this stuff and try and destroy him. Well, those documents are now public. And so it shows that these chemical companies are willing to do dirty tricks. They're willing to lie. They're willing to misrepresent themselves. In California, Prop 37 over genetically modified labeling. They presented media materials to the community there before the election that were filled with lies, misrepresentations. They tried to use the FDA's logo, I think it was, and they put a version of what looked like the FDA's logo on their material, indicating that their material was approved by the FDA. It wasn't at all true, wasn't at all factual. They made that up. They misrepresented themselves. They later apologized for it. Well, apologizing, after the fact here in Hawaii, here in Maui County, it's going to be too little, too late. And that's why we're doing this. So SHAKA will continue to present, information as best we can that is, like I say, independent of corporate manipulation. We're able to get information from all around the world. There's listservs and researchers that are doing stuff all over the world. What you'll hear from the company, what you'll hear on the quote-unquote pro-GMO side, only comes from one or two sources. It's coming from the manufacturers of these things. They're controlling the message. They're controlling everything that you're going to hear on the pro side. And so it's going to be very different than what you'll hear from us. We've also, and to do that, to bring you information and in a way that that you can access it, we require some financial assistance. And we've launched a crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo. If you go to shakamovement.org, there's a link to the Indiegogo campaign, and we're raising funds now to do direct mail pieces, to do brochures, to have talks, bring professionals in, independent researchers, to tell you the story of what's really going on that's not filtered through these corporate forces. And we need your support to be able to do that and continue doing that, so that you have the opportunity in November to make your own informed decision. Even if you work for the companies, nobody knows what lever you're pulling when you're in the ballot booth. You get to decide. Your boss can't see what you're doing. So, even if you work for the companies that are telling you, and if you work there, you know that they're telling you. I mean, we all know that what you're going through. We all know that there's a portion of the community here that understands that they're being manipulated, that understands that they're being lied to, but their income is at stake, and we feel for you. The company tells you, they threaten your jobs. It's not the only job. There are other jobs. We'll help you find a job. The SHAKA movement, one of the things that we've got in development leading up to November is something like a job bank. Working with the county, working with the state and federal agencies. It's been done before. County Council Gladys Beja was instrumental in getting state and federal money when the hotel closed on Molokai. And they were able to bring those resources to the community for job retraining, to help people find new jobs. We're looking at the same kind of thing, creating a list of companies here on Maui that are willing to hire you, willing to receive your resume and put you into their system so that you can have a job that doesn't put you and your family at risk. It doesn't take much exposure to some of these pesticides to radically change your life. There was a recent article in, I think it was Newsweek magazine, of farmers across the United States that are committing suicide. And the understanding why they're committing suicide is because they don't always take all of the precautions that they should when they're working with pesticides. The stuff gets around. It gets on their shoes. They track it home. You could be tracking this stuff home. If you're a farm worker, you could be tracking this stuff home to your kids. I mean, the floor mats in your truck. You think that there's no pesticide residue in the floor mats of your truck? I mean, the stuff gets on your shoes, you get into the truck, the dust, the dirt, it's in your clothes get washed with your kids' clothes, and these pesticides migrate. They move around, and suddenly your kid gets it. Your pregnant wife is exposed to it. And, these are heavy-duty chemicals. These are chemicals that are designed, they're placed there because they disrupt things. They're placed in the environment because they cause problems. They cause problems for plants, they cause problems for bugs. But they also cause problems for you. It just needs to stop. There's so many questions around it all. There's so much going on that we don't know about, that they refuse to tell us about. And it's only getting bigger and bigger and bigger as their industry grows. So this moratorium, the November election, is so very important to stop them for now. With the GMO and the heavy pesticide use and the experimentation, especially the experimentation. God, come on. open field experimenting of pesticides and chemicals. Did you sign a release that says that you're willing to be a guinea pig? You know, they're here in Hawaii because if something absolutely disastrous happens, they've got some chance of containing it before it transmits to the entire world because of our geographic isolation here. Did you sign up for that? I didn't sign up for that. None of us did. It shouldn't be happening here. It's not ethical. It's not right. And fortunately, we've got scientists that are willing to state that and testify to that and are helping to drive this movement. This is real stuff. We're not making this up. It's not fear mongering. They will tell you, that it is, but it's not. This is real stuff. There are birth defects that are happening more prevalently than they used to. Why? Well, what's the probable cause? They're loading the environment down with chemicals that are designed to disrupt biological functions. And then when people start having symptoms of disrupted biological functions, they say, no, it's not us. It must be something else. It's never them. Well, that's what they say. But they lied about DDT, they lied about dioxin, they lied about Agent Orange, they lied about all of these things. And we believe that they're lying today. And through November, you're going to see more and more and more of their lies. I'm going to play for you now an interview that we did with Dr. Tyrone Hayes about his experience with these chemical companies and the kind of campaigns, black op campaigns that they launched against him. And he'll describe some of the things that you can expect to see right here in Maui County from these companies as we get closer to the November elections. So we'll take a few minutes and we'll be back after this interview with Dr. Tyrone Hayes. Thank you. Was able to give you a little bit of a download of what's going on here on Maui. Mm-hmm. Do you have some advice for the residents of Maui and what they need to consider in all of this?
Well, my advice is to do what it appears is already being done, and that's to keep fighting for personal rights, keep fighting for public health, fighting for the rights of our children, fighting for the rights of the environment. Much of what the agro-chemical industry is about is making money, not feeding the world. 20% of the world dies of starvation because they don't have access to staples, and our biggest crop in the U.S. we eat directly less than 2% of. That's corn. So fighting for public health, and don't assume that somebody else is looking out for you.
Well, aren't there regulatory agencies that are supposed to be looking out for it?
There are regulatory agencies. I believe that those regulatory agencies, such as the FDA and the EPA, have been compromised. They are political entities run by political appointees, the EPA, for example. And I believe that even when the science is there, the EPA itself has even said that they put a price tag on human health and on human life, and they weigh that against the cost of getting rid of a chemical from the environment.
Well, doesn't the EPA do its own testing? Is there anything independent that they do?
There are EPA scientists that do testing of chemicals for sure. In the case of atrazine, for example, 3 of the most damning and most significant findings with atrazine are that when pregnant rats are exposed, it causes abortion. It also causes mammary or breast abnormalities in female fetuses that are exposed in utero, and it causes prostate disease in male pups that are exposed in utero. 3 independent EPA laboratories produce that science, and yet that science is not being used to regulate the chemical properly, in my opinion.
And why do you think that is?
Politics and economics. I think the EPA and I think all the scientists involved, I'll show some data now from the company, that they know exactly what these chemicals do, but now atrazine, for example, being used on corn is all tied up in the ethanol industry and the renewable fuels industry and all those, the lobbyists and the politics and economics around those issues.
How did this get so out of control?
I think part of it is history. So when most of these chemicals, when most of the 80,000 chemicals, certainly most of the pesticides that we use came on the market, there was no EPA. So now we've got chemicals out there that were never regulated, that were never tested. They were tested, for example, in World War II and then just brought here for agricultural purposes. Now the EPA is doing its best to try to catch up and regulate chemicals that are already out there that we've already been exposed to for lifetime already.
So, for instance, we have a major agrochemical company here on Maui that presented to the county a whole stack of 2,000 reports. Is that stuff current, and is that stuff accurate? Has anybody verified that stuff?
Depends on what you call a report. I mean, for example, Syngenta likes to say that atrazine has been shown to be safe in over 7,000 studies. Well, those studies aren't available to you or me. They aren't available to the public. They haven't been peer reviewed, so they haven't been vetted in that way. These are sometimes reports of just measurements, or who knows what it is they've tested. But certainly of the published literature that's out there, one, there's not that much out there on many of the chemicals that we're talking about, atrazine being one of the exceptions. And two, what's out there is the EPA is obliged to weight more heavily these industry studies, and they more or less collaborate with industry on these studies to make the regulatory decisions.
So those regulatory decisions essentially favor the agrochemical companies?
Absolutely. They favor the chemical companies.
And what watchdog agencies are there?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to that. Especially in this climate where research funding for independent research is drying up, and the chemical industry has unlimited resources to fund study after study after study, which are oftentimes poorly conducted studies. And sometimes in the case of atrazine, it's even in their best interest to submit poor studies, because then the EPA says, oh, all these studies are done really poorly, and so we can't evaluate the compound. Remember, I was funded. I worked with these guys at Syngenta, so I know that was one of their tactics, is to present study after study after study that's inadequate, and they know that it's inadequate, but it just muddies the water. And then what people hear as public is that, oh, all these studies were flawed, and so we can't tell anything. In fact, that's part of their plan.
What other, backhanded techniques do they have that we should be paying attention to?
Well, in my own case, for example, they specifically set out to discredit me. They specifically hired scientists to, quote, show that they could not repeat my studies, and then they went after me personally. They went after me when they couldn't prove my science wrong after spending, probably hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars. Then they went after me with personal attacks.
Was that effective?
No, that was not it. Where I come from, you don't back down from the fight. If anything, it made their situation more difficult. If anything, it taught me, as I've said before, I now know I've been tested by the best. I have no fear of the rest. Because they spent millions of dollars trying to discredit me, you'll see in some of their handwritten notes, trying to link me to a scandal so that, the environmental groups wouldn't want to be associated with me, and they failed. I mean, they went through my life, they went through my science, they went through my data, and they failed. So I'm very confident now in both the science and the work, and in the way that I live my life and the choices that I've made.
Is there what they call disinformation out there?
Oh, absolutely. One of the tactics is you put information out there and you flood people with information. You tell people that, they'll say things like, I refuse to share my data. So, they're trying to discredit me. In fact, that's just not true. My data or science was originally conducted under the auspices and under the guidance and directly watched by Syngenta. They received all of my raw data, all of my information. In my subsequent studies, the EPA was in my laboratory, observing everything we did, collecting the data, reanalyzing the data. So the original data were available, but when people hear that, and they think it's from a reputable source, when people hear that my work couldn't be replicated, which is absolutely not true. There are dozens of laboratories around the world that I've collaborated with now and published with now that produce similar data independent of my work. The only scientists who found that atrazine doesn't cause problems in animals are the scientists that they've funded.
There seem to be a collection of independent people who say that they're independent scientists that seem to justify everything that's GMO and criticize everything that's anti-GMO. Do you think some of these people are professionals?
Are they professionals? It depends on your definition of professional. They're professional somethings.
Are they being paid for their opinion to express their? Tell me that back.
So it's a known fact that, for example, in the case of atrazine, Syngenta paid scientists. They paid people to write papers. They paid pundits to put their names on ideas and opinions, and they paid people to go after me. That's a fact. So we have those documents showing that they paid people like Steve Malloy, they paid people like Alex Avery, they paid scientists like Klaus Werner and James Carr to say that they couldn't replicate my work. Those are words that were put into people's mouths and purchased.
And so here on Maui, we have this local initiative, and the local initiative is receiving criticism. Do you think that perhaps some of that criticism is manufactured and people are paid to criticize the movement?
Oh, absolutely. The industry will pay people. They'll have people come to talks, for example. They'll probably have somebody here tonight. They'll pay people to publish op-ed pieces in local newspapers, and this is one of their tactics to try to really dishearten people and get people to back down, and to provide misinformation from those people who aren't adequately informed.
We have, an opportunity to put an initiative on the ballot. The companies are at the same time lobbying to take away our right to do that. They want to legislate and preempt the community from being able to make rules about what happens here in the community. Have you seen that happen elsewhere and in other ways? That
doesn't surprise me. I mean, I've been, for example, where I've testified in Minnesota, where the company will pay busloads of people to come in and sit in on the legislative hearings to influence the local Congress people, to make them think that most people don't want a safer environment, for example, to make them think that people really want to use chemicals that they know are harming the environment and harming themselves and their families.
So do you think people in this community would do well to be skeptical of people that are promoting the GMOs and criticizing the alternatives?
I would say always be skeptical. I'm a scientist. I'm skeptical of myself. I look at my data, I go, that can't be true, let's repeat it. My students tell me something and I go, show me the data, show it to me again. Don't believe me either. Go back, dig out the data and decide for yourself. Don't believe in anything, but follow the data.
Well, most people aren't scientists, and they're not going to have the ability to do that. They have to take somebody's word for it. The general public just, at some point just takes people's word for it.
Well, I think in that regard, and that's not to say that, I think you have to look at the source. And I think if you know somebody has a financial interest, a conflict of interest, then I think you have to question them more critically.
Some of what happens here on Maui and in Maui County is, experimentation. We're a petri dish because we've got 4 growing seasons, and they're doing unique work in growing seed corn, for instance, that they distribute around the world. Do you think that Hawaii and Maui County has some unique set of circumstances that makes it at greater risk than the rest of the country?
I think Hawaii is at greater risk for a number of reasons. One is these are new pesticides, new GMOs. These are things that have not been tested, that are being released into the environment for the first time. It's being released in a place that you can do it, I understand, 4 times per year, so you're getting hit harder that way. It's being released in an environment that's very fragile, that's very unique. A lot of endemic species, endemic ecosystems, limited fresh water, limited topsoil, and I think it's an absolute disaster. What I'm hearing about what's going on here in Hawaii and on all of the Hawaiian Islands.
Do you think that they chose to do this work here in part because if something bad happens, they've got a chance in hell of containing it?
I think it's a possibility that they're thinking there's a chance of containing it. And I think also there seemed to be a way to go around the Clean Water Act, I was told. And I think, again, it's also a unique environment with many growing seasons where they can continue to do their research year-round.
And is there, in light of that, are there particular precautionary measures that should be taken here? That it's reasonable to take? And what I'd like to try and get at is the precautionary principle. At what point does the precautionary principle trigger in here in Hawaii?
I think the precautionary principle should be applied everywhere. I apply it in my house. If I'm going to bring something home to my wife and my daughter and my son, and there's a possibility there's a risk to them, to their health, to their well-being, then I think we should have the right to say, no, we don't want that here. So not just in Hawaii. Again, I think Hawaii might be unique because of the fragile ecosystems and because the potential for long-term permanent damage. But I think the precaution principle should be applied everywhere. Everywhere there's people, everywhere there's animals, everywhere there's an environment that we care about, globally.
Is there a difference in the risks related to the growing of GMO entities and the pesticides that are associated with such practices?
Well, I'll tell you my issue with GMOs. My issue with GMOs are not with GMO directly. My issue with GMO is the following. 90% of the seed that we grow are owned by 6 chemical companies. They're owned by 6 chemical companies that are generating GMO products. There's an inherent conflict of interest. So the original promise of GMO was that we were going to have BT corn and we were going to stop using pesticides because the corn was going to make its own pesticide, for example. And it's just the opposite now. Now we're engineering corn and cotton and soy so that it requires pesticides, so it requires more pesticide, because that's what's in the best interest of the chemical companies that own the seeds. That's my biggest problem with GMO right now.
Is the United States isolating itself from the rest of the global economy because of this course?
The U.S. has a big impact, and the U.S. has the potential to do damage far beyond its own borders. So, for example, you'll often hear, I just did interviews in Canada, and you'll hear the Canadian government will say, well, the U.S. EPA approved it, or you'll hear the Australian government say, well, the U.S. EPA approved it. So the U.S. has the potential to do damage around the world because of the policy and because of the poor decisions that it's making, not just with atrazine, but with other agricultural practices as well.
The agrochemical companies, maintain staunchly that they are for farmers and that anybody that is against GMO is against farmers. What do you think?
I think so. Anybody who's against GMO or against farmers, and farmers are for GMO. I think the many cases I've seen of farmers who, for example, have been sued because GMO seed was found on their property or because GMO pollen blew onto their property, I think those farmers would disagree. I think the company has the money to find the farmers who would say that, but I don't know in general if you can make that statement.
Chemical cocktails. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we seem to be experiencing here in Maui County, there's some voluntary disclosure practices that have been adopted, and they simply tell us how much they put on and where they put it on, that we get a gross figure at the end of the year. But they don't tell us in what combinations. We don't know at what time they did it. What's the risk inherent in that?
Well, we've done some studies, and so have others, that when you get a mixture of pesticides together, you get effects, you get impacts that aren't predictable by looking at the individual compounds. We've shown that, others have shown that, and so it's a dangerous matter, and it's one that I think needs to be addressed. I think it's one that there needs to be reporting, and I think people have a right to know in their communities what chemicals have been applied and when they were applied and in what combination.
And the testing that they do, this is backing up a step, the testing that they do is isolated compounds. Could you speak to the difference of what they test for and what actually happens in the field?
I mean, there's some academic scientists that are testing chemical mixtures, pesticide mixtures, as well as fertilizers mixed in, but there's no systematic approach by the EPA or by anybody that I know of to look at mixtures, and on top of that to evaluate and assess mixture effects in the wild, or to even, it's almost an impossible task, one would argue, is how do you regulate a group of chemicals, especially when you might have farmers side by side that are applying different sets of chemicals. So it'd be like telling one farmer it's okay to use atrazine and metolachlor, and then saying, but it's not okay to use metolachlor and chlorpyrifos, but then the two farmers side by side are using them and they all get mixed in together. So how do you regulate that? It's very difficult. It's very difficult to study. It's also very difficult to regulate.
Well, they did it with secondhand smoke and cigarettes. Sure. I mean, there's 500 compounds.
Yeah, but we're talking 80,000 chemicals. That's a huge, and then even once if it were possible to look at every combination for even chemicals that's used on, let's say, 1 square mile, then how do you pick out which chemicals were the bad combinations? Was it the full mixture? Was it 2 chemicals in particular? Was it one mixed with this but not the other? It's very difficult. So I'm not arguing it's an easy thing to do. I think it's difficult to study. It's also difficult to evaluate, and it's difficult to regulate.
Well, so that's if we push for that, are we being unreasonable?
I don't think so. I think we have a right for environmental health, for public health, for our future. I think we have a right to push to know these things. For that matter, it's the food that you get. We have a right to know what's been applied to it.
in your experience, what gets sprayed in fields, does that leach into communities around the fields?
Oh, absolutely. So there's direct drift when you spray, right? So there's direct drift, but in the case of atrazine, for example, it can go up on dust and travel 1,000 miles and come down in rainwater. I mean, that's been shown. It's been shown in Europe. It's been shown here. So even if you were, for example, working on an organic farm, if you're surrounded by farmers in that community that aren't organic or that are using pesticides, then you're still at risk.
How do we get out of this mess?
It's difficult. I mean, I don't know that saying a complete ban on pesticides, or for example, is the way to go. But I think certainly with pesticides like atrazine and a few others, where we know that they cause harm to the environment, that there's a risk to public health, we start there and then we keep going. And again, I think atrazine is a poster child for what needs to be done, and we keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and we set a precedent. And
locally, I mean, local initiatives, is it worth pursuing?
That's the start. Grassroots and local. Keep moving forward and building momentum until we get bigger movements. I think that's the only way it's going to happen. I have no confidence in the EPA and no faith that the EPA is going to do it. And we have to take every avenue. That has to be litigation. It has to be pushing our representatives for legislation. And that also means pushing the EPA towards regulation. We have to hit them at all angles.
There are those who say that this is just ultimately going to end with the federal government stepping in and saying that Hawaii is a national security requirement, that the agrochemical companies, for national security purposes, need to be able to do what they're doing, and that we will become a recognized sacrifice zone.
That'd be unfortunate.
You think that something
but
like that...
But it wouldn't surprise me.
Right. You think that there is a scenario where that could happen?
Nothing surprises me. So, I mean, I've seen a statement from a spokesperson to the EPA that, in fact, I'll show the quote in my talk, that there's a price, that we put a price on shortened lives, et cetera, and we weigh that against the cost of removing the chemicals. So there's a price tag on all of our heads. And one of my big issues is we don't all have the same price tag. So oftentimes low income or minority people or maybe Hawaiians, certain states have a lower price tag on their head. And I think that's unfortunate. And I also think that goes against what this very country was founded on. I think it's unpatriotic.
I think that's an excellent place to leave it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your work. Welcome back to the SHAKA Movement's Malama Aina show. I'm Sam Small. That was an interview with Dr. Tyrone Hayes, who was here on Maui a couple of months ago, presenting an entire evening talk about his experiences with atrazine research and Sargentia, a company that originally hired him to research that particular chemical, and then when they didn't like the results of his research, that showed that chemical atrazine, which is used here on Maui, that atrazine, it disrupted the development of frogs, is what he saw it in, but others have documented it in other species as well. What they tried to do to him personally, to destroy him as a professional, and the kind of manipulations that they will do and have done in other places where there have been contests and people fighting back against being exploited by these companies. To what lengths will they go? And what lengths will they go here in Maui County to get their way? To convince voters in November that what they're doing is good for you. We don't think what they're doing is good for you. Quite opposite. We think that we are all being exploited. We think that we're all being used as guinea pigs. None of us signed up for this. What they're doing is not ethical. And we have an opportunity, for at least for a little while, to stop them. I say a little while because state legislation twice has been attempted to strip the county of our right to regulate farming practices. They call it a right to farm bill. and even our local senators from District 6 voted against the best interests of the people when she floated a bill in the Senate that would have stripped the county of its right to regulate farming practices. They say that those practices are regulated by the federal government and the state government and overseen by regulatory agencies. Well, we know that those agencies are not up to the task. We know quite clearly that the FDA has been manipulated by Monsanto. They were brought in. We know that the Supreme Court has a presence of Monsanto on it. Clarence Thomas used to be a lawyer for Monsanto, and he sits on the Supreme Court today. The only time he writes a decision is when it's related to biotech. Those are the only decisions he writes, and every one of the decisions that he writes is in favor of the industry, the corporations. Loopholes have been built into the system. The companies were invited to write the regulations, and they did so. And they wrote into those regulations loopholes, and we're living with those loopholes today. And it's not good. It's not right. And we've got an opportunity, like I say, until they take that right away, we've got an opportunity to at least stop them for a little while, at least to make them run appropriate studies. Not a study about what they told the regulators in Washington. What we're asking for is a study of what they actually do in the fields in Maui County. What are they actually spraying? When are they actually spraying it, and in what combinations are they doing these things? Those are the kinds of studies that we want, and that the company will pay for. If the moratorium goes through, they can afford it. If the moratorium goes through, if the people of Maui County are courageous enough to do this in November and vote for this moratorium on GMO and pesticide practices and open field experimentation. Open field experimentation. That's what's going on up there in those fields. And it spreads out into every aspect of life in Maui County. You're exposed to it, I'm exposed to it, our visitors are exposed to it, everybody, your kids are exposed to it. How many of you know people that are getting sick? I've lost friends recently to weird cancers. You know, just bam, out of nowhere, somebody just gets sick and they're gone a month later. From weird stuff. How many people do you know that just have food allergies, that never had food allergies before, and suddenly they've got food allergies now? Well, these things are not accidental. It's not just happening in a vacuum. It's happening because they've enclosed us in their pesticide bubble. And we're all being exposed. They just increased the agrochemical companies, presented data to the Environmental Protection Agency and said, we need you to raise the level of exposure, of acceptable exposure to glyphosate, the principal ingredient in Roundup. Because the stuff is because we're doing such a good job selling it to everybody, this stuff is everywhere. And the concentration in the environment is rising. And, it used to be said that you could be exposed and it wouldn't be a problem to this much. But now we're telling you that that was too little. Now we're telling you that it's okay for you to be exposed to this much. And the EPA, they don't do any of their own independent research. They accepted what the company had to say based on no real studies. And they said, we're going to trust you. That you're telling the right thing, that you're saying that this is okay, and because you say it's okay, we're going to accept that. That's not doing you a service. That's not looking out for your best interests. That's a regulatory body in Washington that is totally geared towards protecting the interests of business over the well-being of people. The regulators have an acceptable level of collateral damage, an acceptable level of public illness, disease, birth defects. They're willing to accept a certain amount of that just to be able to keep a chemical, pesticide, herbicide on the market. If it's on the market, their job is to keep it on the market. And that's at times at the cost of the people that are exposed to it innocently. That's you. That's me. That's your kids. That's everybody that comes to this island. And they don't live here. The people that are making the money, they don't live in this environment. And they don't seem to care. So, you're going to be inundated with messaging, professionally, produced videos. I know they're shooting videos because I got the call from a high-end public relations company in California. They wanted to hire my equipment and crew and go out with teleprompters into Molokai and do interviews with people where they put the words on the screen, and so the people stand in the field and maybe they're farm workers and they're going to tell you what the company wants them to say. They're not saying it because they necessarily really feel this. They're saying it because the company thinks they look good on camera, and they're willing to say the words that the company puts in front of them. So that's not, people really giving their heartfelt testimony. Those are people who are scared for their jobs. They've been chosen by the company because they look a certain way and present and represent a certain sector of the population. And they've been given words to say. And they're saying those words because they've been spoon-fed those words. And that's all going to be packaged into videos, and that's all going to be commercials and little documentaries, and you're going to see this stuff all over the place. And it's propaganda. As in California, when the Prop 37 GMO labeling, a portion of what they said were out and out lies and fabrications. And they retracted it after the fact. That's a technique, it's a skill that they have. Don't fall for it. You're going to hear criticisms in our own community. People that you think are, expressing themselves, honestly, they're actually being paid. Op-ed pieces in the newspapers and magazines, people are going to say that, they're going to say the most terrible things about SHAKA. They already are, and it's not true. We're a grassroots local organization that is doing this because we care and we're scared. I live here. I'm scared. I've got friends that are getting sick. I know people that are dying, from strange illnesses, strange diseases. There's families with birth defects, the kids, being born with their intestines outside their bodies. That's happening here more and more. Why? What's the reason? Well, the chances are it's the chemicals that they're applying in the fields that are leaching out into the population. And the moratorium is designed to actually study that. What's going on in these fields that's affecting you Forget what the reports and the studies that they sent to Washington. Most of that stuff really had nothing to do with safety. You know, they've got a stack of reports, 1,200 scientific studies. Most of them had nothing to do with safety. Most of those studies are compromised in a variety of different ways. When the scientists, independent scientists, sit down and review that stuff, it's BS. It's just, it's scary how they've manipulated the system to be able to perpetrate this against you. So we welcome your participation. Look for SHAKA events over the next coming months, public meetings, educational talks, potluck dinners where the community can get together. We're looking for ways to support the community in a number of different ways. You know, there's farming there's farming that has to be done in Maui County. You know, there's not enough food to feed people here. We could be Hawaii once was completely sustainable. It was like 40 or 50 years ago that, you know, they grew. Everything that everybody needed to eat was grown here in Hawaii. They did not have to import food. We're at a point where like 90%, 95% of the food that gets eaten in Maui is imported here. There's no reason for that. The economics are supportive of sustainable agriculture if we put together a program that makes sense. And we'll be presenting a lot of those details over the next a couple of months to show and prove that there are other ways to do farming. There are other ways to make money doing farming. It doesn't have to be chemically dependent. It doesn't have to saturate our islands with chemicals and pesticides and poisons. And it doesn't have to be profit-driven where the resources here are exploited and the product is shipped off of the island, leaving only poisons behind. We can have an agricultural system here in Maui County that is diverse, that is sustainable, that provides for food sovereignty, where we're not vulnerable to corporate control, where people are involved in the agriculture in their community. They're supportive of the agricultural system. It can be done, and Maui is the perfect place to do it. Help us get this message out. Help us, share our message with your friends and family. Go to shakamovement.org. Contribute to our crowdfunding campaign. We're raising funds to be able to put more and more of this content and real information, unbiased, independent information that's not manipulated or controlled by corporate interests, the way every other message is. Every message that you're going to hear between now and November is controlled by the corporations. Everything that's pro-GMO. And we're not anti-science. They're going to say that we're anti-science. We're not. We're not anti-anything. It's all pro. We're pro-safety. We're pro-farmers because they're actually at risk to these pesticides, this exposure, the farm families. You don't hear about the farm families that get sick because they pay them to shut them up. They do all kinds of things behind the scenes. We're even feeling the effects of it in our own organization. We know that they've done things to some of our people, and we know that they've infiltrated our organization. And we know how deeply they will go into dirty tricks to get their way. So be aware, understand what you're hearing. Some of it is not going to be true. They're going to paint a picture, that the world needs their GMO crops. They're going to paint a picture that, like a cartoon character, a talking cockroach, is going to tell you that the world needs Monsanto, that the world needs genetically modified foods. And it's just not true. In the 25 years that genetically modified foods have taken over the marketplace, there have been developments in natural farming techniques that don't require the heavy pesticides. Natural farming techniques, mechanical changes. There's a change that they came up with in researching how to plant rice. The individual rice that gets planted, they do it differently now. And because the physicality of how they do it, no chemicals, no pesticides, no additives, it's just the physical way that they plant the rice is resulting in a 10-fold increase in yield. So there are mechanical ways to improve farming practices that have nothing to do with pesticides, nothing to do with herbicides or heavy chemical use or genetically modified organisms. None of that is necessary to feed the world. None of that is necessary to feed the people here in Maui County. And there is no reason that you need to be exposed to these chemicals and pesticides. There's no reason that our visitors have to be wary and scared of coming to Maui because they don't want to be exposed to GMOs and heavy pesticides. There's no reason other than their own personal profits for any of this to be happening. And you have the opportunity to stop it. Vote for the moratorium come November. Support the SHAKA movement and others that are working to educate our community and empower your family and your friends to make informed decisions and for you to be in control of your life decisions, not some global multinational corporation. They don't get to decide what's good for you. You get to decide, and we're here to help. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. We'll be back next week with the SHAKA Movement's Malama Aina show. And thanks, Akaku.